The radio crackled with the kind of static that meant death was listening. Somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, 8 Navy SEALs were learning what it felt like to be prey. Their voices, normally steady as bedrock, carried the sharp edge of men who'd miscalculated. Badly. "Overlord, this is Neptune 27, came the transmission, barely audible over the whine of incoming mortars. "We are compromised. Say again, we are compromised." The operations center at Bagram Air Base fell silent. On the massive tactical display, 8 green dots pulsed against a terrain map that looked like the surface of Mars, all jagged peaks and deadly valleys. The SEALs had been inserted 12 hours earlier on what intelligence had called a routine sweep. Find the weapons cache. Secure the site. Extract at dawn. Simple. But the Taliban had been waiting. They'd turned the narrow mountain pass into a killing funnel, with overlapping fields of fire from positions that seemed carved into the rock itself. The SEALs were pinned in a boulder field with nowhere to run, their ammunition running low and their extraction helicopter shot down before it could even reach the landing zone. "Sir," the radio operator said, turning to Colonel Marcus Hendricks, "they're requesting immediate air support. Apache flight is 20 minutes out, but—" He paused, checking his display. "The weather's turning, ceilings dropping fast." Hendricks studied the meteorological report with the expression of a man watching his options evaporate. Low clouds, high winds, zero visibility in the mountains. The kind of conditions that turned even the best pilots into statistics. The Apache were fast and deadly, but they were also complex machines with sophisticated sensors that didn't work well when Mother Nature decided to intervene. That's when Captain Vera Castellic spoke up from the corner of the operations center, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "I can get them out." Every head in the room turned. Castellic was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, her weathered flight suit bearing the patches of someone who'd seen more than her share of bad days. At 34, she'd been flying A-10 Warthogs for over a decade, but she was still treated like the odd woman out in a world of fast movers and high-tech warriors. The Warthog, officially known as the Thunderbolt II, was old, ugly, and slow. In an age of stealth fighters and precision-guided everything, the A-10 seemed like a relic from another war. "Captain," Hendricks said carefully, "the ceiling is dropping to 500 feet. Your aircraft—" "Was built for this," Castellic interrupted, pushing herself off the wall. Her call sign was painted on her helmet in faded letters, Reaper. Some people thought it was because of the enemy she'd killed. They were wrong. The A-10 Thunderbolt II squatted on the tarmac like a mechanical gargoyle, its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from the nose like the proboscis of some prehistoric predator. Unlike the sleek fighters that dominated modern warfare, the Warthog was all function and no form, titanium armor wrapped around a pilot, and a gun that could punch through tank armor like it was paper. Castellic ran her pre-flight check with the methodical precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in conditions ranging from sandstorms to blizzards. Her hands moved over switches and gauges with muscle memory, but her mind was already in the mountains, calculating approach angles and escape routes. The weather report was getting worse by the minute. Clouds were building like gray fortresses along the mountain ridges, and the wind was howling through the passes at 40 knots. Most pilots would have called it unflyable. Most pilots didn't fly Warthogs. "Reaper, this is Tower," came the voice in her headset. "Conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Recommend you hold until weather improves." "Tower, Reaper," Castellic replied, her voice steady as granite. 8 souls are counting on me. I'm not holding for weather." She throttled up, feeling the twin turbofans spool to life with their characteristic whine. The A-10 wasn't fast, cruise speed was barely 300 knots, but it was honest. No fly-by-wire computers making decisions for her, no stealth coding that would fail in the rain. Just her, the machine, and the mission. As she lifted off into the gray morning sky, Castellic thought about the seals who were waiting for her. She'd never met them, didn't know their names or their stories, but she knew they were the kind of men who thought air power was for show. The kind who believed that when things got really bad, it was boots on the ground that mattered. They were about to learn different. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan rose from the desert like the spine of some ancient beast, their peaks disappearing into a ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down with malevolent intent. Castellic flew beneath them at 500 feet, her altitude dictated not by choice but by physics. Any higher and she'd disappear into the gray nothing above. The radio crackled with updates from the SEALs, their situation growing more desperate by the minute. They were down to their last magazines, and the Taliban fighters were closing in from 3 sides. The 4th side was a cliff that dropped straight down into a valley that might as well have been on the moon. Neptune 27, this is Reaper, Castellic transmitted, her voice calm despite the turbulence that was rattling her teeth. I'm 5 minutes out. Can you mark your position? Reaper Neptune, came the reply, and she could hear the disbelief in the SEAL team leader's voice. Did you say A-10? In this weather? Affirm, hope you boys brought sunglasses. What the SEAL didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Vera Castellic had earned her call sign the hard way. 3 years earlier, in a valley not 50 miles from where she was flying now, she'd been part of a close air support mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Intelligence failure, bad weather, friendly fire, all the elements that turned military operations into tragedies. 8 Marines had died that day, including her best friend from flight school, Lieutenant Jessica Phoenix Martinez. The investigation had cleared Castellic of any wrongdoing, but she knew the truth. She'd been a split second too slow, a degree too cautious. She'd chosen survival over sacrifice, and 8 mothers got folded flags because of it. She'd requested the call sign Reaper the next day, not because she was death incarnate, but because she carried the dead with her. Every mission, every sortie, every time she pulled the trigger, they were watching, they were waiting, they were judging. The GPS coordinates appeared on her display, and Castellic began her descent into the Valley of Death. The scene below looked like something from Dante's imagination. The SEALs were clustered behind a pile of boulders that provided marginal cover from 3 directions, but none from above. Taliban fighters were moving through the rocks like mountain goats, their AK-47s chattering sporadically as they closed the noose. Neptune 27, I have eyes on, Castellic transmitted, banking hard to avoid a wall of granite that seemed to reach up like grasping fingers. Count approximately 30 enemy combatants. They're using the terrain well. Roger that, Reaper. We're marked with infrared strobes. Please tell me you can do something about our problem. Castellic studied the tactical situation through her targeting pod display. The Taliban had positioned themselves perfectly, using reverse slope positions and natural cover to make themselves nearly invisible from above. It would require precision that bordered on artistry, the kind of flying that separated the good pilots from the legends. But there was a problem, a big one. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted. The cloud ceiling was dropping toward the valley floor, and visibility was shrinking by the minute. In another 10 minutes, she'd be flying blind. The smart play would be to call it off, wait for the weather to improve, bring in a full strike package with all the bells and whistles. But the SEALs didn't have 10 minutes. From what she could see on her sensors, they had maybe 5 before the Taliban fighters closed to grenade range. Neptune Reaper, I need you to trust me on this one. When I tell you to keep your heads down, you keep them down. Copy. Solid copy, Reaper, we trust you. Those 4 words hit Castellic like a physical blow. Trust. The one thing she'd lost 3 years ago in another valley, with another team that had counted on her to bring them home alive. She pushed the Warthog into a dive that would have made a Falcon proud. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon was not just a weapon. It was a force of nature wrapped in titanium and fury. 7 barrels, each one capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 4,200 per minute. When Castellic squeezed the trigger, the sound that emerged was not the sharp crack of conventional firearms, but the deep, primal roar of a giant ripping canvas. A sound that could be heard for miles and struck fear into the hearts of anyone on the receiving end. But first she had to get close, very close. The Taliban fighters had chosen their positions well, using the natural contours of the mountainside to create interlocking fields of fire. Taking them out would require multiple passes, each one more dangerous than the last as they adjusted to her tactics. The smart money said it couldn't be done, not in these conditions, not with the margin for error measured in inches rather than feet. Castellic had never been smart money. Neptune heads down now. She came in from the north, skimming the rocks so low that her landing gear sensors were screaming warnings. The first burst from the GAU-8 lasted exactly 2 seconds, 280 rounds of depleted uranium traveling at nearly 3,500 feet per second. The effect on the Taliban positions was devastating. Bodies and rocks and weapons disappeared in clouds of dust and debris. But she wasn't done, not even close. Banking hard to the right, Castellic rolled the Warthog into a knife-edge turn that would have been impossible in any other aircraft. The A-10's massive wings and rugged construction allowed her to pull G-forces that would have torn apart a more delicate machine. She came around for a second pass, this time from the east, her cannon finding targets that had been invisible moments before. The Taliban fighters, those who were still alive, began to break and run. But running in the mountains was different from running on flat ground. The terrain that had been their ally now became their prison, the same rocks and crevices that had provided cover now channeling them into kill zones where Castellic's rounds found them with surgical precision. "Holy shit," came the voice from Neptune 27, filled with awe and disbelief. "Reaper, that was. I've never seen anything like that." But Castellic wasn't listening to the praise. She was thinking about Phoenix Martinez, about 8 Marines who'd trusted her to bring them home, about the weight of responsibility and the cost of failure. "Neptune, this is Reaper. Area is clear. Call in your extraction." The extraction went off without a hitch. The SEALs were lifted out by a rescue helicopter that arrived just as the weather closed in completely, turning the mountains into a gray void that would have been impassable for the next 6 hours. 8 men went home to their families because a woman in an old, ugly airplane had refused to accept the impossible. But for Vera Castellic, the mission wasn't over. It never really was. She flew back to Bagram through weather that would have grounded commercial aviation, her Warthog cutting through turbulence that bounced her around the cockpit like a ball in a washing machine. Every few minutes, she'd check her instruments, not because she didn't trust them, but because staying busy kept her mind off the other things, the things that happened when the shooting stopped and the adrenaline faded. The debriefing was perfunctory. Colonel Hendricks praised her flying, the intelligence officers updated their databases, and the maintenance crew began their post-flight inspection. Just another day at war, just another mission completed. But word was already spreading through the base. The story was being told in mess halls and ready rooms, passed along through the informal network that connected warriors across service branches and national boundaries. An A-10 pilot had pulled off the impossible in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. More importantly, 8 Navy SEALs were telling anyone who would listen that air power wasn't dead after all. It just needed the right pilot. That night, Castellic sat in her quarters, staring at a photograph she kept on her desk. 8 young faces smiled back at her, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like a lifetime ago. Phoenix Martinez was in the center, her arm around Castellic's shoulder, both of them grinning at the camera like they owned the world. "One down, Phoenix," she whispered to the photograph. "One down." The next morning brought new missions, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the old ways still had value in a high-tech world. But something had changed during that flight through the mountains. Word was spreading beyond Bagram, beyond Afghanistan, beyond the insular world of military aviation. The SEALs, it turned out, were not shy about sharing their story. Within days, the tale of the A-10 pilot who'd saved their lives was making its way through special operations communities around the world. Navy SEALs told Army Rangers, who told Marine Force Recon, who told Air Force pararescuemen. The details changed with each telling. The weather got worse, the enemy more numerous, the flying more impossible, but the core message remained the same. There was a pilot out there who could do things that defied explanation. A pilot who flew an airplane that was supposedly obsolete with the skill of someone who'd been born with wings. A pilot who'd earned the respect of men who didn't give it easily. Captain Vera Reaper Castellic was becoming a legend, whether she wanted to or not. But legends, she knew, were just stories people told themselves to make sense of a world that often made no sense at all. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She was a pilot who'd failed once and was determined never to fail again. Every mission was a chance at redemption. Every life saved was a step toward balance. And in the unforgiving skies above Afghanistan, balance was the only thing that mattered. The requests started coming in 3 weeks later. Not through official channels. The military had its own Byzantine way of assigning assets, but through the informal network that connected the men who did the hardest jobs in the worst places. Special operations teams throughout the theater began asking for a specific pilot by name, something that was virtually unheard of in the world of close air support. They wanted Reaper. Colonel Hendricks found himself in the unusual position of having to explain why his most junior A-10 pilot was suddenly the most requested close air support asset in the entire theater. The explanation was simple. Word had gotten out that she could do things other pilots couldn't do, fly in conditions other pilots wouldn't attempt, and deliver ordnance with a precision that bordered on supernatural. But there was more to it than technical skill. The special operations community was small and insular, bound together by shared experiences that civilians could never understand. They could sense something in Castellic that went beyond flying ability, a dedication, a hunger, a willingness to risk everything to bring them home alive. They didn't know about Phoenix Martinez or the 8 Marines. They didn't know about the weight she carried or the debt she was trying to pay. They just knew that when the chips were down and the situation was hopeless, there was a pilot out there who would find a way. The missions came fast and hard after that. Valley sweeps in weather that grounded every other aircraft. Danger-close fire support missions where the margin for error was measured in feet. Extraction support in terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Each time, Castellic delivered. And each time the legend grew. But legends, as Castellic was learning, came with a price. The other pilots in her squadron began to treat her differently, not with hostility, but with a kind of reverent distance that she found more isolating than outright rejection. They looked at her the way you might look at a force of nature, with awe, with respect, and with the knowledge that you were witnessing something beyond ordinary human experience. The problem was, Castellic didn't feel like a legend. She felt like a woman trying to outrun her ghosts. The turning point came on a Tuesday in November, during a mission that should have been routine. A Marine reconnaissance team had been inserted into the Coranging Valley to observe enemy movement patterns. Intelligence suggested light enemy presence, minimal threat, standard surveillance operation. Intelligence was wrong, again. The Marines found themselves outnumbered 10-1 by Taliban fighters who had been waiting in positions that suggested they'd known the Americans were coming. Someone had talked, someone had betrayed the mission, and now 12 Marines were about to pay the price. "Reaper, this is Falcon 1-6, came the transmission, the Marine team leader's voice tight with controlled panic. "We are in contact. Effective enemy fire from multiple directions. Request immediate air support. Castellic was already airborne, flying what the mission planners had called a routine patrol. The irony wasn't lost on her. In Afghanistan, there was no such thing as routine. Falcon 1-6, Reaper inbound. What's your situation? We're pinned down in a compound about 2 clicks north of the primary LZ. Enemy has us surrounded and they're moving closer. We need ordnance on these guys now, or we're not going home. The compound appeared on Castellic's targeting display as she crested a ridgeline, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The Marines were trapped in a cluster of buildings that offered some protection from small arms fire, but none from the mortars that were beginning to fall around them. Taliban fighters were moving through the surrounding terrain like ants, their numbers growing by the minute as reinforcements arrived from hidden positions throughout the valley. Worse, the enemy had learned from previous encounters with American air power. They'd positioned their heavy weapons in schools, mosques, and other buildings that were technically off-limits under the rules of engagement. It was a cynical tactic, but an effective one, forcing American pilots to choose between following the law of war and saving American lives. Falcon, I see your position. This is going to be tricky. They're using civilian infrastructure as cover. Reaper, we don't have time for tricky. We're down to our last few magazines and they're getting closer. You need to do something. Castellic stared at her display, calculating angles and distances and collateral damage probabilities. The mathematics of warfare were unforgiving. Every decision carried weight. Every choice had consequences. But beneath the cold logic of combat, she could hear something else. The voices of 8 Marines from 3 years ago, asking her why she hadn't been faster, braver, better. Falcon 1-6, talk to me about the buildings. Any signs of civilian activity? Negative, Reaper. Place looks empty, but you know the rules as well as I do. She did know the rules. She also knew that rules were written by people who'd never been shot at, never had to choose between following orders and watching good men die. The legal scholars and policymakers who crafted the rules of engagement had never sat in a cockpit at 500 feet, watching friends bleed out in the dirt, while enemy fighters used human shields as tactical advantages. But Phoenix Martinez would have followed the rules. Phoenix had been the kind of pilot who colored inside the lines, who trusted the system, who believed that doing things the right way was the only way. Phoenix Martinez was dead. Falcon, keep your heads down. I'm coming in. The first pass was surgical. Castellic brought the Warthog in from an angle that allowed her to engage Taliban positions while keeping her rounds well clear of the protected buildings. The GAU-8 spoke with its characteristic roar, sending 30 rounds into enemy fighting positions with devastating effect. But it wasn't enough. The Taliban fighters had prepared for this, creating redundant positions and fallback sites that allowed them to continue the attack even after taking casualties. For every fighter that fell, another seemed to take his place. Good hits, Reaper, but they're still coming. We need more. Castellic banked hard to the left, setting up for another pass. But as she lined up her attack run, she saw something that made her stomach clench. Taliban fighters moving through what looked like a school compound, their weapons trained on the Marines from protected positions that she couldn't engage without violating every rule in the book. The choice was simple and terrible. Follow the rules and watch 12 Marines die, or break the rules and live with the consequences. She thought about Phoenix Martinez, about honor and duty and the weight of command. She thought about 8 Marines who trusted her to make the right choice, and about 12 more who were trusting her now. And then she thought about something else, the difference between being right and being effective. Falcon 1-6, I need you to confirm that all civilian structures in your immediate area are clear of non-combatants. There was a pause, and when the Marine team leader came back on the radio, his voice carried the weight of a man who understood exactly what was being asked of him. Reaper, I confirm all structures in the immediate area are clear of non-combatants. Repeat, no civilians in the target area. It wasn't true, and they both knew it, but it was the truth they needed to save 12 lives. The second pass was different. This time, Castellic didn't hold back. The GAU-8 cannon found its targets with ruthless efficiency, punching through concrete walls and steel reinforcements as if they were tissue paper. Secondary explosions lit up the valley as ammunition stores cooked off, and the disciplined Taliban attack dissolved into chaos as fighters broke and ran for cover that was no longer there. Within minutes, the shooting stopped. The Marines called in their extraction, and another 12 American families would not be receiving folded flags and heartfelt condolences. But as Castellic flew back to base, she knew that something fundamental had changed. She'd crossed a line, made a choice that couldn't be unmade. The rules of engagement existed for good reasons: to protect civilians, to maintain moral authority, to ensure that warriors remained human even in inhuman circumstances. She'd broken those rules to save lives, and she'd do it again if she had to. The investigation began 3 days later. Someone had analyzed the gun camera footage. Someone had counted the holes in buildings that were supposed to be off-limits. Someone had decided that Captain Vera Castellic needed to answer some difficult questions. The hearing was held in a sterile conference room at Bagram Air Base, presided over by officers who'd never fired a shot in anger but were experts in military law and proper procedure. They sat behind a polished table, their uniforms perfect, their questions pointed and unforgiving. "Captain Castellic," said Colonel Patricia Woodson, the investigating officer, "you engaged targets in structures that were clearly marked as protected sites under the rules of engagement. Can you explain your actions?" Castellic sat at attention, her dress uniform bearing the ribbons of someone who'd seen more combat than everyone else in the room combined. Her lawyer had advised her to say as little as possible, to claim she'd acted under the exigent circumstances doctrine, to hide behind legal technicalities. But Vera Castellic had never been good at hiding. "Ma'am, I made a tactical decision to engage enemy combatants who were using civilian infrastructure to conduct military operations against U.S. forces. My assessment was that the immediate threat to American lives outweighed other considerations." "Your assessment," Colonel Woodson repeated, her voice carrying the particular disdain that lawyers reserved for people who acted on instinct rather than procedure. "Captain, you are not authorized to make that assessment. The rules of engagement exist for a reason." "Yes, ma'am. They exist so that staff officers can sleep better at night knowing they followed proper procedure while men die in the field." The room went silent. Castellic's lawyer closed his eyes and shook his head slightly. Colonel Woodson leaned forward, her expression cold as winter. "Captain, you are out of line." "No, ma'am. I was right on line. Right on the line between doing what's legal and doing what's necessary. Between following rules written by people who have never been shot at and saving the lives of Marines who were counting on me to bring them home. Those rules would have gotten 12 Marines killed." Castellic's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. "And I've already got 8 deaths on my conscience. I wasn't about to add 12 more." The hearing continued for 2 more hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Castellic had violated the rules of engagement, had acted outside her authority, had placed military objectives above legal considerations. In the bureaucratic calculus of modern warfare, these were sins that could not be overlooked. But something else was happening outside that conference room. Word of the hearing had spread through the base like wildfire, and the response was unprecedented. Special operations teams throughout the theater began submitting formal requests that Captain Castellic be retained in theater. Marine units she'd supported sent letters of commendation. Even Navy SEALs, notorious for their disdain of other services, weighed in on her behalf. The message was clear. Whatever the lawyers thought about rules and procedures, the men who actually fought the war knew the difference between a pilot and a warrior. Colonel Hendricks found himself in an impossible position. Castellic had clearly violated regulations, but she'd also become the most effective close air support pilot in his command. Relieving her would be legally correct but tactically disastrous. Retaining her would send a message that rules didn't matter, but losing her would cost lives. In the end, military pragmatism won out over legal purity. Castellic received an official reprimand that went into her permanent record, along with an unofficial commendation that recognized her exceptional performance under adverse conditions. She would remain in theater, would continue flying missions, would continue to be the pilot that special operations teams requested by name. But the cost was higher than anyone realized. The investigation had forced Castellic to confront something she'd been avoiding for 3 years: the weight of command, the burden of life-and-death decisions, the crushing responsibility of being the person others counted on when everything went wrong. She'd saved 20 lives in 2 missions, but the math of survival wasn't that simple. Every life saved carried the weight of future expectations, future missions, future moments when split-second decisions would determine who lived and who died. And in the gray area between legal and necessary, Vera Castellic was beginning to understand the true cost of being a legend. The winter of 2012 was particularly harsh, even by Afghanistan standards. Snow fell in the mountains like a white curtain, cutting visibility to mere feet and grounding most aircraft for days at a time. But the Taliban didn't respect weather patterns, and neither did the special operations teams that hunted them through the frozen valleys and ice-covered peaks. Castellic found herself flying missions in conditions that would have been considered impossible just a few years earlier. The A-10's rugged design and simple systems made it uniquely suited to extreme weather operations, but even the Warthog had its limits. Ice buildup on the wings, frozen fuel lines, hydraulic fluid that turned to sludge in sub-zero temperatures. Every flight became a test of both machine and pilot. But the missions kept coming. Rangers trapped on a mountainside during a blizzard, Delta Force operators conducting a raid in whiteout conditions, Special Forces teams running surveillance in terrain that looked like the surface of Antarctica. Each time they called, Castellic answered. "Reaper, this is Viper 72, came the transmission during a particularly brutal January storm. "We have wounded and need immediate extraction. Weather is below minimums for standard aviation, but we're hoping you might see it differently." Castellic was already bundled in cold weather gear, her breath visible even inside the heated cockpit. The temperature outside was 20 below zero, and the wind was howling across the airfield with enough force to rock her aircraft on its landing gear. "Viper 72, what's your location and status?" "We're approximately 40 clicks north of Bagram, elevation 8,000 feet. We have 1 urgent surgical and 2 walking wounded. Taliban broke contact about 30 minutes ago, but they'll be back." 8,000 feet. In a blizzard, with wounded men who needed medical attention that couldn't wait for the weather to improve. Castellic looked out at the swirling snow and smiled grimly. Just another day at the office. The flight to the pickup zone was like navigating through a white hell. Visibility was measured in aircraft lengths rather than miles, and the turbulence was so severe that Castellic had to grip the stick with both hands to maintain control. Ice formed on her canopy faster than the heating system could melt it, creating a crystalline spiderweb that turned navigation into guesswork. But the A-10 pressed on, its twin engines grinding through the storm with mechanical indifference. The aircraft had been designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, and weather was just another form of enemy fire as far as the Warthog was concerned. "Viper 72, I'm 2 minutes out," Castellic transmitted, her voice steady despite the battering her aircraft was taking. "Pop smoke when you hear my engines." "Roger that, Reaper. Be advised, We've got about a 10-minute window before the bad guys regroup and come back for another try." The smoke appeared as a dark smudge against the white landscape, barely visible through the blowing snow, but enough to give Castellic a reference point. She brought the A-10 into an orbit around the pickup zone, her cannon ready for targets that might emerge from the storm. What she saw through her targeting pod made her heart sink. The Special Forces team was trapped on a narrow ledge halfway up a nearly vertical mountain face, with Taliban fighters moving through the rocks above them like hunters stalking prey. The extraction helicopter would have to hover in impossible conditions, exposed to enemy fire from elevated positions, while trying to pull wounded men off a mountain ledge in a blizzard. It was a suicide mission for the helicopter crew, and everyone knew it. "Viper, this is Reaper. The LZ is hot. I count at least 20 enemy combatants moving to positions above your location. This is going to be a problem." "Copy that, Reaper. We're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place here, literally." Castellic studied the tactical situation through her sensors, her mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. The Taliban fighters were using the storm as cover, just as she was, moving through terrain that would have been impassable in good weather. They knew the Americans were trapped, knew that extraction would be difficult if not impossible, and they were taking their time to set up an ambush that would destroy both the ground team and the rescue helicopter. But they'd made one mistake. They'd forgotten about the angry woman in the ugly airplane. "Viper, keep your heads down. I'm going to clear you a path." What happened next would be talked about in special operations communities for years to come. Castellic brought the A-10 down to an altitude that put her wingtips below some of the mountain peaks, flying through snow and ice that would have blinded a normal pilot. But she wasn't relying on her eyes. She was flying by instruments and intuition, using her targeting sensors to identify enemy positions, and her cannon to eliminate them with surgical precision. The first pass cleared the high ground above the Special Forces position. The GAU-8s depleted uranium rounds punching through rocks and ice to find Taliban fighters who thought they were invisible. The second pass took out a machine gun nest that had been preparing to engage the rescue helicopter. The third pass was pure artistry, dropping ordnance with such precision that enemy fighters simply disappeared into the swirling white void. When the shooting stopped, the mountain was quiet except for the howling of the wind. "Viper 7-2, area is secure. Call in your extraction." "Reaper, that was, I don't even have words. You just saved our lives." But Castellic wasn't listening to the praise. She was thinking about Phoenix Martinez, about 8 Marines, about the debt that could never be fully paid. Each mission was a step toward balance. Each life saved a small victory against the mathematics of loss. The rescue helicopter made it in and out without taking a single shot. 3 wounded Special Forces operators went home to their families, their injuries treatable, their lives intact. And high above the mountain peaks, a pilot in an aging continued her patrol through the storm, ready for the next call, the next mission, the next chance to prove that some debts could be paid one life at a time. By spring of 2013, the legend of Reaper had spread far beyond Afghanistan. Military blogs picked up the stories, veterans forums shared the tales, and aviation magazines began featuring articles about the A-10 pilot who was redefining close air support in the modern era. The details varied with each telling. The weather got worse, the odds longer, the flying more impossible, but the core message remained consistent. There was a pilot out there who could do things that defied explanation. Pentagon officials began to take notice, not all of it positive. In an era of precision-guided munitions and high-technology solutions, Captain Castellic's old-school approach to air-to-ground warfare was seen by some as a throwback to a more primitive time. Her methods worked, but they didn't fit neatly into the PowerPoint presentations and strategic plans that governed modern military thinking. More troubling, from a bureaucratic perspective, was the way special operations teams had begun requesting her specifically. The military ran on standardized procedures and interchangeable parts, not on individual personalities and personal relationships. Having frontline units attached to specific personnel created logistical nightmares and operational vulnerabilities. But the numbers didn't lie. Mission success rates for close air support operations involving Captain Castellic were approaching 100%. Casualty rates for ground forces she supported were the lowest in theater. Whatever concerns the bureaucrats had about proper procedure, they couldn't argue with results. Colonel Hendricks found himself walking a tightrope between competing interests. His superiors wanted him to rein in the maverick pilot who was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. His subordinates, the men who actually fought the war, wanted him to clone her. The solution, when it came, was typically military in its elegant simplicity. Promote the problem to someone else's level. Captain Castellic, Hendricks said during what she'd assumed would be